Good evening. We have a workshop scheduled for 5:15. I'll read the public notice. The City of Mount Juliet Board of Commissioners will have a work session in the Commission Chamber at City Hall, 2425 North Mount Juliet Road, today from 5:15 until 6 p.m. to discuss the stormwater utility. And with that, I'll recognize our Deputy Director. Our Director.
Yeah.
Wanted to demote you.
Yeah.
Mr. Barlow.
Right. Just don't call me late for supper. Okay. So thanks everybody for coming tonight. This is our fourth work session in a row that my department has participated in. So not to really wear you all out, but I guess, yeah, probably we are. So tonight, the topic du jour is stormwater utility. And we've been talking about this for a while now. We first presented this, did a work session about a year ago, just prior to the budget session last year. And that was on the heels of our February flood event last year. We had another flood event earlier this year. I had a couple actually to note, but with that, the timing has been good for this. We've been going through this contracted with CDM Smith. They've been doing all the grunt work, as I like to call it, the heavy lifting of the plan development. They've been going through analyzing our system. This is a very critical meeting tonight as far as defining the expectations, and we'll get to that a little bit later on in the presentation. But without further ado, I want to introduce Dave Mason with CDM Smith. Dave has been heading up the efforts along with Aaron Rogie. Aaron's been, I think, our modeling man. You can take that however you wish. He's been doing all the stormwater modeling and everything and doing everything there. So, but I'll pass it on to Dave. Dave, kind of walk us through the work done so far.
All right. Take it from over here again.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
All right. In case you need on the microphone. So yeah, thanks for the intro. Again, we're here today to talk about the stormwater utility and the progress that's been made so far and where we stand sort of from decision-making process. And then Aaron's going to give a little bit of a progress update on the stormwater master plan and how that ties into this overall study on the utility. So we're going to jump right in, and up front, we're going to talk a lot about what the work that's been done the last few months, which is working with staff on understanding what types of services are being provided, what the costs of those services are, and what some potential levels of service are for other communities that are doing things a little differently. We'll also talk about the stormwater utility itself, what a rate structure looks like, what some of the analysis has been done already, for Mount Juliet, so you understand how it may impact your community more directly. And then, as I mentioned, Aaron's going to talk about the master planning. So, what we think about as a successful roadmap for this type of project. This has been done all over the country, all over Tennessee, certainly. We really look at it as a two-phase approach, and we're kind of approaching the end of this phase one, which again, phase one is more the analysis side and the cost of service, what type of services may be needed in the future to meet the customer needs. Then talk about the rate structure piece of it. Whereas phase two is more the implementation side. So once there's a decision that this is the right approach for the city to go down, this is really more of what Andy referred to as the grunt work, measuring impervious areas, getting the billing file done, that sort of thing. So that's really the phase two part that would be happening more this summer and fall if you were to decide to move forward with a program like this. So really, what's the first step is, why are we having this discussion? And so it's pretty clear in this community that flooding's been a big challenge. And that's really one of the drivers for looking at the level of funding for the program and whether there needs to be some alternative approach to viewing that. This is different for every city, but in order for it to be successful, we really want to look at what's important for Mount Juliet and what they want to fund. And again, start to understand what the cost of those services are for the city to address some of the issues that you've got, and really identify the benefits. Because ultimately, if the public is going to pay a fee for the stormwater service, we need to make sure they understand what the benefits of that fee are. So that's really what a lot of this first phase of the program is about. And so this is just sort of kind of a step back, and you'll hear these terms throughout. So just want to explain them. Stormwater covers a lot of different areas. When we're speaking to the public and elected officials, we really try to break it down into these four categories that most folks have an understanding of. First one up in the top left is the management of the program. So that's Andy's time, Shane's time, that sort of thing. The master planning component that Aaron's going to talk about. Over on the upper right is the regulatory compliance. So not aware, those are acronyms up there. I'm not going to go through all those today, but that's really Adam's program and what he's doing from a water quality perspective that the state and the federal government requires of a community like yours. That's regulatory compliance piece. Operation and maintenance is what most people think about when they think about stormwater. That's the boots on the ground, cleaning out catch basins, cleaning ditches, repairing things. And then lastly is the capital improvement. So that's more your big projects. Something floods, we need to replace a culvert. Things are undersized, we need to upsize it. So those are sort of those bigger projects that you'd think of that would show up in your budget as a line item in a capital program. So those are really the four categories that we break the program down into, and we start to compartmentalize those costs and understand what the level of service is for your community within each of those four categories. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but what we see in a lot of communities that don't have a utility program funding, a dedicated program for funding the stormwater service, a lot of these things that we just talked about happen throughout the city. They're not compartmentalized into one division. They tend to happen throughout the division, different divisions of the city. In your case, things are happening in public works that are stormwater related. Engineering is a subset of that. Things can happen in parks and rec that are stormwater related, planning, of course. So we, part of our effort up front here is to find where all those things are within the city that are stormwater related and that would potentially be funded by a stormwater utility fee, identify those, identify what resources are being devoted to that, and again, the cost of those services. And so to do that, we come in here, and we're really looking to your staff to help us identify those. And so we've had a workshop with your staff, all the different divisions. Some of y'all were participated in that effort, and we're interviewing staff to understand what they're doing on a daily basis, what type of resources they've got in place to execute the work that they need to do. What are they hearing from the public that the public may want to see, but we don't have the money in place to do that. So that happened a few months ago. And we've been working on that over the last couple of months through the budget that you've got the last few years to understand where those cost centers are and start to quantify that. Because a lot of cases, as you all know, you can't go to the budget and find what's the line item for everything stormwater related. It's not there. And that's very typical of communities that don't have a dedicated revenue stream to identify that. So we're really putting those pieces together. In some cases, it's a percentage of someone's time. It's not really, hey, a day a week we go out and clean catch basins. It's not their primary role. And so we're looking to find all those kinds of things. And so here's a summary of that. And again, going back to those four categories that we talked about. And so I think what you probably see in your budget now is a few $100,000, $300,000-$400,000 that are related to development review fees and those types of things that maybe stormwater, you may think of as stormwater. But as we quantify all the things that are doing that your city's doing stormwater related, we're seeing about $700,000, a little over $700,000 a year across those categories that are stormwater related services. And then we kind of broke it down here on the left-hand side for what department they're showing up in. So again, some of Andy's time, Shane's time on the administration engineering piece, the regulatory compliance. It's mostly the group that reports to Adam and Adam himself, and some of the costs associated with their water quality program. Operation maintenance, of course, is the catch basin cleaning, that sort of thing. And then lastly is the capital, and we'll talk about that a little bit later here. But there really isn't, if you go back the last few years of the budget, you don't see stormwater capital projects in there. There may be things that happen on an emergency basis or that sort of thing, but it's not planned out. And that's one of the things that we identified. So again, on an average annual basis, we see your program spending about $720,000 a year on stormwater services. So what does that get you? This is where we get to this level of servicing. What does it actually provide for the city? And so what a lot of people ask, we talk about stormwater utilities and talk about potentially a new fee. They want to know what's the absolute minimum we got to do. And that's one level of service to look at. And so for stormwater, which is different than maybe water and sewer, there's very little that's required by the state or the federal government to do. And that's really your water quality piece. So your permit programs. But what people call you guys about are all the other things. It's the erosion, the flooding, the street's not clear when it rains. Those aren't required minimums anywhere. So those are things that it's a local community decision to determine how much should we fund those things and what is the public benefit from those. And so that's really where this level of service discussion gets, and want to look at where are you guys today and where might you need to be in order to meet the needs of the public. And so here's one piece of our scope here, is to do an independent assessment of where we think you're at from a level of service standpoint. And again, reference you back to those 4 categories that we've been talking about. And this is a matrix that we've developed over time doing literally hundreds of these types of projects around the country. So we can kind of gauge, similar sized communities, similar types of programs, and how much they're spending. And this is where we see you all at today. And this is not, I always like to clarify, this is not any kind of judgment about how staff are doing their work or how you're doing your job. It's really what types of resources are in place to do the things that you would need to do to execute an effective stormwater program. And so on the program management side, we talk about from the planning piece is really that how do we get it? A lot of this scale is from going reactive to proactive. And so most cases with your car or whatever, you get an oil change, you're trying to be proactive, right? You change your oil every 3,000 miles. Well, we think about a stormwater program the same way. Can we maintain our system proactively, or can we not? And so, in this case, we're initiating the master planning component now, and so that's a step in the right direction. But that's not something in place today. So that's where we have the program on the program management side. One good piece of information is on the regulatory perspective. You are meeting your regulatory minimum, so EPA is not going to chase you down. The state's not going to chase you down for not meeting your requirements. But one thing to note there, and Adam's well aware, is a new permit's coming out. It's in public notice right now. And so the city's going to have a new permit. It's going to have additional requirements that you don't have today. So those are going to need to be funded. And so that's a new 5-year permit. It's going to come out later this year. And so we think you're minimally compliant there, but there's probably new things that got to happen in the next year to start working on that next phase. Operation and maintenance. What we heard a lot from staff is there's not dedicated resources just to maintain the stormwater system. When somebody calls, they get out and do it, but there's not a routine inspections and routine maintenance, that sort of thing. So we see that program is primarily responsive today. And then lastly, I've already alluded to this, is on the capital side, there's no capital plan for stormwater, and that's really what the master planning is going to help develop. But as of today, there's not dedicated funding every year to do capital projects. And so that's where we probably see the program most efficient. Any questions on that? You got one?
Yeah, I have one.
Go for it.
Thank you, sir, for being here tonight, first of all. So when you went back to the slide 4, or let me see here, it was a slide with stormwater management functional area, which was the 4 different boxes.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, like you talked about the cost level of services versus being proactive and reactive. Obviously, like you said, that we're doing this like the state minimum, but is there anything out there that obviously, like you said, being proactive, making sure that we're, that we're aligning with the preventative maintenance steps, to be able to go out there and kind of say, okay, this is our, kind of like what we do with routine maintenance,
Mhm.
quarterly PM, semi-annual, and annual. Are there things in place that we should be looking at as a city compared to what other cities are challenged with? And what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, and we'll get to a little bit of that here in a minute, but yeah, absolutely. I think, most communities that have sort of taken that next step, one of the first things we worked with Gallatin in the last couple of years, one of the first things they did was we didn't have a dedicated stormwater crew, a crew that is not pulled off on doing leaf collection and snow removal and paving and all these other things that pull them away from their job. It's nope, we're going to go out and routinely inspect X amount of the system per year. We're going to clean X amount of the system per year. We're going to go take care of the ones when there's a big rainstorm event forecast. We're going to make sure those are clean so that when it rains, we're not going to get flooding that are just maintenance related things. So on the maintenance side, it's those types of activities. And then more on the forefront of that program is people that are moving toward more of an asset management type approach where they're inventory their entire system. We're going to get all the condition of it, and then we're going to put it on a maintenance and repair schedule over time. And that's sort of like the Cadillac A program where people are at now, where they're saying, hey, we got a failing infrastructure. We're going to go out and repair these things systematically so they don't fail in an emergency situation where you have, potentially risk for the public and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the scale that we see is, having dedicated crews versus like being fully proactive and knowing what everything's out there and addressing those in a systematic way rather than, waiting till something fails.
So you're saying more of like a life cycle analysis is going to be like the more Cadillac.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with that being the case, obviously I'm like with working with Andy and the rest of his team, is that something that we're going to have like a long drawn out plan that's going to give us, the good, better, best method for what we're looking for within the city? And then the second part to that is how do we get the message out, or like I'm not asking you, but what have you seen in the industry? What is the best way to get the message out? Because again, the city can only do so much. It's also part of what our families are doing in their own yards. Because again, a lot of people think, oh, I'm just going to put this over, in the common area, or else I'm going to dump it down here. I mean, obviously, like, what are some of the challenges that you've seen with other cities to be able to get that message out also?
Yeah, there's definitely a public education component to all this. And one of the things that's a lot different than water and sewer, again, is usually you have control of most of that system as if you're, a municipal government. But stormwater, as you're alluding to, it crosses private property all the time. So you got water from the street exiting onto somebody's property, going to somebody behind them, and they might get upset at their neighbor. And in some cases, it's a private citizen versus private citizen issue. So there is definitely an education component to that. And some of that's covered in Adam's program in terms of the types of things that the state requires. But really, those are still water quality focused requirements that are under the state permit, where it's really up to the local government to start to inform citizens about, hey, some of these things are controlled by us and it's in the right of way. And once it gets off the right of way, it can be the property owner's responsibility, unless, again, we see some cities that are, really well funded. They start to take over easements maybe that cross private properties. That's again next level cost to do. But people start to work toward that by maybe doing some private property type projects here and there where it makes sense, where there's public runoff involved. But it is an education component that is a challenge for sure. Do you want something to add? Or Andy?
Yeah. I think to your question I was thinking on the asset management. So we just did something very similar for our roadway network. And so we went through a full asset management on that. It'd be something very similar. So your thoughts about the, as far as identifying the maintenance needs, is taking what you have out there, full analysis of all that system, and basically giving yourself a 5-year report of saying, here's what we need repaired over the next 5 years. And you do that about every 5 years or so, and which is the bar that we've set with our paving preservation and maintenance program. And I think, to the point about the public awareness, I think you're probably going to get a lot of public awareness out of the utility. People are going to be asking, what's my money going towards? And so I think there's a very big public outreach aspect of that, of demonstration of what this is going towards. When we talk about the regulatory compliance, people aren't really going to be that interested in that part of it. They're going to want to know, is my yard flooding? They're going to be wanting to know, are we taking care of things? How well are we taking care of our systems? What are we doing to help prevent flooding? And so those are the big things that we're going to have to make sure that we're staying on top of, as far as letting people see where their money's going.
So the numbers that were shown is just kind of, is it fair to say it's like a framework for the department from where you want to go from now to where you need to be? And then beyond that, it's going to be the introduction of capital projects as we take on bigger and other things.
Yeah. And I guess part of the rest of the presentations, we'll kind of go through what these numbers are going to look like. And then moving forward from here through the remainder of the years, we'll get into our actual capital plan. Kind of, we talked about that two-phase approach. And so we won't have our capital plan defined here in the next few months, but we will have it as we move on and we get towards implementation of the utility.
Yeah. So I've got some numbers, just kind of throw at you a little bit to see kind of what we see from, and I won't have time today to get into all the details behind each one of these, but basically what we look at is, where's your spending level today, and what might it cost on an annual basis to add some of these things that we talked about. So again, if you start on the capital side, it's, hey, what if we add $250,000 a year, they're devoted just to capital projects, or $500,000 a year to capital projects. What might that impact look like on your annual budget? That operation maintenance line, that's looking at, dedicated crew, the equipment associated with those crews, what might you need to spend on an annual basis to cover that sort of thing. Not as much additional stuff on the although on the regulatory compliance side is where we add some of these asset management type components, because for the permit, there's an inventory piece where you need to know where all your pipes and catch basins and things are related to the permit. So there's some inventory components there. But anyway, this kind of gives you a sense of, and these are benchmarked against other communities of similar sizes, what kind of dollars per capita do communities that are providing these services spend at a higher level than maybe where you are today. So that gives you a framework. And for us, as we get into talking about a stormwater fee, it's like, well, what would a fee need to be in order to cover those types of services? And so that's where you'll see in a minute. But that's kind of, I think, a lot of what the questions is, what kind of money are we talking about? And that's gives you a sense on an average annual basis, what might those be. And as I've talked to Andy about, they really look at this as a menu. You wouldn't take your whole program up like that. You may say, well, we really need to tackle capital, and that's why we're doing a master plan. So we may spend more money in the first 5 years on capital, not really raise the level of service on these other pieces, and that would be balanced over time. Once you've got the major capital things done, then maybe you're spending more on maintenance going forward. So sort of think of it as more of a menu and not like, hey, we're going to jump up level by level here.
Yeah, the way I thought about it is ordering at a restaurant, a la carte type menu. You've got each of your 4 main categories. Those are all, I would say, judging from our objectives of what I've heard from the commission, we've heard from our residents, is the capital projects. That's something we've not been doing, but it's something that's absolutely necessary. The operation, maintenance, and the other 3, we're doing those today. I mean, those are all 4 very required categories, in my opinion. But again, you think about this. I mean, you could flip-flop capital projects and operation and maintenance costs today. I mean, it could be a scenario where we take time building up staff, operations and maintenance staff, equipment. We focus more on projects in the first little while. As we start to get a few personnel up and running, you could do a slow ramp up there. There's 1,000 ways to slice it, though.
This just kind of shows the general capacity that you'd be looking at.
Question.
Sure.
Are the fees adjusted annually, or is it a fixed fee for a period of time?
They're generally, I mean, they can be. It's just like any other rate. They can be. But when we do this analysis, we really look at use a 5 or 10 year window to say, all right, what would the fee need to be to cover your costs for the next 5 years? And because if you think, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, it's all related to the impervious area that's on the ground. So every new thing that gets built, your revenue is going to tick up a little bit every year based on the new buildings and structures, because they're generating more runoff. So we set the fee so it's sustainable for 5 years. That's usually our goal. You wouldn't touch it for the first 5 years. And then after that, you'd start to reassess. Hey, have we captured a lot of our priorities? Do we need to change it? So a lot of fees will be in place for 5 or 10 years without changing. That's very typical on the stormwater side.
So on this scale, what is the expectancy? Is this so I heard a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan. What is the expectancy here?
So on the capital side, part of our scope is to put together a 10-year capital plan. So the modeling that Aaron's doing right now is identifying flood improvement projects throughout the city, and that'll be put forth in a 10-year plan. So from that perspective, you'll have a 10-year plan out of this for capital spending potentially. And then, at least as far as our rate structure and things we really look at a 5-year window. That's kind of typical to look at on the stormwater utility rate model side, is look at a 5-year window to see what your spending is going to be. And so that'll be a portion of that 10-year plan on the capital side, but we look at more the shorter term, more predictable cost.
Do you have a question, Commissioner?
Going back to the levels chart.
This one
Yeah,
here?
that one. Did you say that you were going to cover the estimation of the bill amount, the resident bill amount
Yep.
for each level?
Well, yep.
We hadn't got there yet. Okay.
Yep. All right, so kind of jumping ahead, and this next section really just kind of gives you some background on what a stormwater utility is and how it's different from how you fund with tax dollars. And so we really look at multiple ways that you can fund your program. But when we get here at this point, we're saying, hey, there's a gap in what we're spending today. How might we close that gap? What's the most fair way, the most equitable way to do that? You're really looking at 2 primary funding mechanisms, whether you raise taxes in the general fund or you look at a user fee program. Those other types of things, there's a lot of money out there right now. grants and loans and those types of things that for infrastructure bill that we've all heard about. Those can cover your capital costs, but they're not really usable for the other aspects of your program. So those are only supplements that we want to take advantage of, but really look at the funding your entire program. It's really from a tax-based system or a user fee funded system. And really look at the advantages and disadvantages of each. Tax-based system, that's already done today. You can collect more tax tomorrow if you needed to. And those can be sufficient to fund all your services. But one of the disadvantages of this is that they're not equitable in terms of the customer. Your stormwater service that you get has no correlation to the tax that you pay. Your tax is paid on your valuation of your property. That has nothing to do with stormwater. Those funds aren't dedicated, as you know. They go into a big pot of money and get spent differently every year. So when we talk about a 10-year plan or a 5-year plan, it's very hard to plan for an infrastructure system if you don't know the money's going to be available. That's why water and sewer are done differently, because you need to fund those things in a more systematic way. On a user fee side, we can make them equitable. We can make them the fees based on the amount of runoff that you generate on your property, which can be correlated to the amount of service you might receive, or at least the amount of burden you're putting on the system that the city's got to collect and maintain. Stable and dedicated, as we mentioned, we can plan with it. We know we have the dedicated resources. And then there's ways to incentivize good practice. So if you're doing things on your property that reduce the amount of stormwater you send to the city, or you clean the water before it gets sent out, we can put a system in place to reduce your fees. So it kind of incentivizes good practice versus another system. But disadvantage, of course, we wouldn't be here talking about it. You got to set up a new system to do this, to collect this money. A new startup costs, a new funding mechanism. So there's some disadvantage and administrative piece to getting that off the ground. But it's no different than anything else you do today. I know you may not provide all these services yourself, but folks are paying water service on the amount of water they use. They're paying sewer based on the amount of volume they generate. Solid waste, you're paying on the amount of trash pickup you get. Stormwater is the same way. We're just looking at the amount of runoff that you generate from your property that the city's got to build an infrastructure system to accommodate. Very common all over the country. There's almost 2,000 of these throughout the country. There's 45 or so cities in Tennessee that do this. Most of the cities across Middle Tennessee are doing this now. So very common practice in the industry. Kind of covered this, but how does it work? It's just like every other utility you pay: water, sewer, electric. It's really based on your burden on the system or your use of the system. And those funds are dedicated by state law. They can't be used for other types of things. And we ultimately want the fee to relate to the service. And the service being provided is the management of that runoff. So if you didn't develop your property, you didn't send stormwater to the street, the city wouldn't need to have a pipe there to collect it and convey it safely down the road. So that's really what the fee is based around, is how much runoff and stormwater runoff, when it falls on your property, that you're generating, that the city's got to have a system to accommodate to safely, for safety of citizens, your neighbors, for your own safety in terms of people discharging upstream of you. And really the best measure of stormwater runoff is impervious areas. So if you build a parking lot, you build a road, that water can no longer seep into the ground. It's going to convey directly into the city system. So that's the best way to measure how much burden you're having on the system. It's been defended all over the country as the best representation from a stormwater fee standpoint. So that's really the most common way people use to set up a stormwater fee. Kind of jump ahead here. So we don't just apply somebody else's model to this. We've done statistical sampling of all your properties in the city to understand what your community looks like from a rate basis. And again, we're measuring the impervious area. And so most cases, impervious area being rooftop, parking lots, driveways. Most cases it's based on the residential unit. So we look at what does a typical home look like. We measure a bunch. We measure 300, 400, 500 of them. We look at how much driveway you have, how much rooftop, and that gives us our average for the city. So what does a typical house look like? And in this case, it's about 3,000, a little bit over 3,000 square feet. So it's not living space. This is, again, on the ground footprint of your driveway, house. And that becomes the basis where we charge everyone else. So if the typical home is 3,000 square feet, if you have a commercial property that's 30,000 square feet, you're 10 times bigger than that typical home. you'd pay 10 times the charge because you're generating 10 times more runoff. That's really the basis of how most of these systems work. And there's some variations that we can get into, but that's kind of the standard, most simple way that people do this. Does that concept make sense?
I think our vice mayor has a question for you.
Sure.
You may have answered this. If you had, I apologize, and I do apologize for being late. They went up canceling all of our Little League games, so I'm here tonight. Would this be classified as an enterprise fund?
Yes. Mhm.
So whatever we do, it has to be completely self-sustaining.
That's
Take
correct.
care of itself, correct? I guess my question is, how are you going to delineate price-wise between HOAs and developments that are non-HOAs when an HOA actually has a vehicle with HOA fees that actually is supposed to take care of the common area runoff and things of that nature? So how are you going to do that? They're not going to be taxed twice on this, are they?
Taxed it.
Well, I mean, the HOA pays a fee for them to take care of whatever runoff and whatever there is. So if you've got that fee going into the HOA dues, they're supposed to be taking care of their own. Then you've got other, and now I don't think we need to hit them again.
Yeah.
And say, okay, per unit, you've got so much ERU coming off your property, so
Yeah,
you're going to have to be hit again. So how does that work?
Generally speaking, the homes are going to get their own charge. So if they've got a water, sewer, we're going to get the billing in a second, but think of it as if they got a water and sewer bill, they're going to get a stormwater bill on top. So if the fee is, let's just say $5-6 a month, the individual homeowner is going to get that fee to pay the city for their stormwater service. The lot that's owned by the HOA, the property that's owned by the HOA, that would be measured separately, outside of the homes, right? So there's a parcel boundary. They're going to get measured separately. And if they've got a clubhouse or a pool or those types of things, those accessory type things, those are going to get measured and charged. That would go to the HOA, and the HOA would decide, well, if that's additional cost for the HOA, then they're going to, maybe change their rate for the customers, but they're not going to get billed twice. The homes are going to get billed on their own. The property that's separate from that's a common area, that's going to have its own fee associated with it.
Well, I guess then if you have an area, and I'm going to use Kelsey Glen, for instance, where you've got a detention pond.
Mhm.
That detention pond, after how many years, fails?
10.
10?
Mhm.
Okay. So after 10 years of them paying in HOA dues, each individual, everyone in that subdivision pays into that fund that's supposed to be maintaining that.
Yep.
So then if we turn around and hit them with another bill, they're being double charged for that. I'm not sure I'm liking that idea.
The detention pond reduces the burden of runoff from that property. It doesn't eliminate, it doesn't capture everything that ever rains and goes in the ground and never comes out. That detention pond is designed to capture a certain size storm. But that runoff, anything above that, is being conveyed back to the city system. So, the one thing I mentioned before is they can get credit for that. So they may pay a reduced fee because they have a detention pond that's operable on site.
Have you ever seen an HOA reduced fund, please?
I don't know about HOA, but I'm just talking about the city can
Oh,
have
okay.
a credit policy in place, or is required by state law actually to have a credit policy in place to reduce the fee of properties that are doing best practices, BMPs being, stormwater pond being one of them. And so they would have a reduced fee versus a property that doesn't have one.
Okay, one final question on utilities, for instance, our sewer fund. If we run in the red for, how was it, 2 years or 3?
2 years.
2?
Mm-hmm.
State picks up, comptroller's office comes in, they set the rates for us. We'll just fall under that same precedent.
I don't know the law on that piece, but I have not seen that happen, at least in Tennessee. I don't know the specifics of the law on that. I don't know if you have any.
That may just be for sewer potentially.
So
That
can we
may
find
just be-
out?
Yeah, and we'll check on that.
Okay.
And of course, that does take into account part of the problems that we have with that, with the state. We have to account for depreciation.
For the what?
Depreciation of the system, which is, as far as I know, not required for stormwater.
Right.
Yeah.
Stormwater regulations are a lot newer than any of the sewer regulations.
Sheila would know what year was it we actually had the state come in and warn us, or did they actually set our rates? Okay.
we were just put on probation. And
Yeah.
then we've recently had another incident.
Okay, so it does
So it's
happen.
happened twice.
Okay, and in 50 years, I would say happening twice is probably not
Right.
horrible, but
It's a little different in that there's not as many regulations requiring you to do specific things like for water and sewer. As I mentioned on the stormwater side, most of it's optional. Again, there's only a percentage of the program that's required by the state to do. All the other things that you do are really up to, it's really the level of service that you want to provide to your customers. So there's not as many regulations around the activities you have to be versus where water and sewer, they're very specific about public health and all those kinds of things. So there's very specific things you got to do that can get you more in the red, as you talked
Yeah,
about.
to the vice mayor's point, I do think that HOA thing is going to be a sensitive issue. I mean, we got two neighborhoods side by side. One neighborhood's got all the drainage on HOA-owned property, and they maintain the drainages. And you got another neighborhood where they put all the drainage right through people's property.
Yeah.
And then it falls to the individual homeowner to maintain that. And you can imagine which one of the neighborhoods is wanting the stormwater utility more than the other one.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, it's getting in the weeds a little bit because when you get into the residential properties are fairly typical. When you get into the non-residential properties, of course, there's much more variation on how. And so we look at the non-residential properties, every one of them. We measure the impervious area in every single one. What we don't necessarily know all the time is how the drainage is operating in each single one. But those are things that we work out during the implementation process of how things are different, where they benefit from having the drainage controlled or not. And so there can be credits in place to reduce the burden on properties that are managing their own runoff.
One thing I would like to point out from that is the stormwater doesn't stop at the pond for an HOA. It goes beyond that. It goes on downstream. I mean, take Providence, for instance. We have Providence. They have their ponds. Del Webb has the lake there. That goes on downstream. It goes through Belinda City, down through on down Old Lebanon Dirt Road on and beyond. So we got to think about this, that projects that we do that the stormwater utility would be responsible for, the people would be paid into, their water doesn't stop at the pond. That's just one small component of the system. And it also doesn't take away from the fact that everybody's home has some impervious area. And that impervious area is no longer being infiltrated down on that property. It does run off from there. And the total volume is or could be, depending on how that pond is designed to infiltrate, it could be pressing on more volume of water eventually. The peak might not be as high, but the volume is still going to be going on. And so that's part of it. You think about, what is the volume of water that runs off of my property that would not have run off before? Pond or no, HOA or no, that's there regardless, and that's there for everybody.
I have one. If that's okay, Barry. Well, I mean, obviously this is hitting kind of close to home for me because my backyard is the pond. So with the recent overlay of the road that's coming down to my street, I now have I would say not all, let's just say an increase of water coming down my driveway now to hit the pond coming off the road. So I'm going to be looking for a credit to come back to my house because I'm help offsetting that as well. So let's kind of look at these options here because again, I am kind of interested in seeing what this next page offers, which is the pricing. Because again, I know there's going to be a cost. I understand that because we do have to have some type of infrastructure. But at the same time, let's make sure that, as what the vice mayor had stated, what is our options when it comes to what the state's going to be, as well as, long term. Because again, once we set this, we want to make sure that we stay consistent with looking out for the best interest of our communities.
Yep. Yeah, and there's as Andy was mentioning, there's a bit of an educational component related to the ponds. A lot of people think they solve all the problems,
No.
And they don't. And the other thing to remember is there's definitely no perfectly equitable, fair way to do anything. You think of your water bill. If I'm right next to the pump station, doesn't cost a lot of money to pump that water to me, but I pay the same amount as the person that's way down the end of the line. There's no perfect equity to any of these things, but the approach here with impervious areas, it's the most equitable way to do it. And we build in credits and adjustments for those peculiar situations where there might be some inequity there. Kind of mentioned this example. Again, the non-residential folks are going to pay in relation to that base, and we call it ERU, or equivalent residential unit. So we look at typical house, and then the non-residential folks are measured, every single one of them. We measure their impervious area, and then we set their number of billing units based on how much they compare to the typical home. I won't go into this today because I know we're running out of time. There's some variation to this. One of the things some communities look at is a tiered rate structure, so that's something we'll evaluate here. But in some cases, there may be a reason to say, all right, well, most folks are kind of toward the middle, toward the average, but there's some really, really big ones out there, and there's maybe some really, really small ones. And statistically, it may make sense to charge them differently. So say, all right, well, 80% of the folks are going to pay 1, but if you got a really big mansion, you're maybe paying 1.5. If you've got a really small 500 square foot home, your mobile home maybe, doesn't make sense to pay you just like that big house. We're going to pay you a little bit less. And so that's something that communities look at to make it a little bit more equitable for folks.
I see the single family and the commercial. What I'm not seeing are the HOAs, which is a very valid point. How do you determine the fees for an HOA?
Yeah, those are charged. So the common area of the HOA would be charged just like, I wouldn't think of it commercial, think of it as non-residential. So if it's not a house, if it's not some kind of dwelling unit, it's going to fall under non-residential. We're going to measure.
You're gonna pick all the up sidewalks, all the common area grass.
Common area stuff, yes, but roadways don't get counted. The roads are across the country hardly ever measured in terms of, so it's not like the common roadways and sidewalks. It's really like the clubhouse. They've got a golf course. They may have the golf course facilities and that sort of thing, but it's not going to be the sidewalks and
So it would be pool, clubhouse.
pool. Yep. So not the pool, but the decking around it. Yeah.
Now take Del Webb, for
So-
instance. I mean, they've got the big central
Wow.
house. They've got all their pickleball courts, et cetera, and so forth. So they would probably have a pretty big amount of impervious to account for. Sorry.
Did I just hear you say the roads were not measured? And
The
not
roads are
taken into
tip-
consideration?
Yeah, the roads are typically considered part of the infrastructure system. So most all the runoff in the city is funneled towards the roadway, and you got curb and gutter, you've got pipes underneath it. So the road is typically considered part of the drainage system and you're not charging for the drainage system itself. So the roadways, unless it's a private road that no one else accesses and it's yours, that's typically how it's done. Again, those are policy choices, but I'm just telling you how they're done across the country. Most don't charge the roadway. But this building would be city-owned property. The city would get a fee for this building since it's developed property just like anybody else. But the road itself is not typically charged.
So typically we don't have private roads, but we have one in here. Do we still do Timber Trail?
Oak Hall is private.
Okay,
As is
so
Del
Oak
Webb.
Hall being private with an HOA, would they not be measured and charged accordingly?
It could be. These are policy choices that you ultimately
Okay.
make. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, you can decide we're not going to charge any
I
roads.
think we decide that.
We're going to only charge public or charge private roads. Those are policy choices that can be made.
All right.
Stonegate.
There's no laws around that kind of thing.
So we get to make the rules up as we go.
Some of them, well, like anything else, right? It's a policy choice on how you want to do
It's
it.
a loaded question.
I just remember this being an unfunded federal mandate from many, many years ago that has cost us time and time again more problems than it's ever been worth.
Yeah.
And just thank you, Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Well, it's your job security, so you really should be thanking Washington, D.C., right?
Helps at times, yes.
Okay.
These are the typical base rates around Tennessee. The ones in orange are ones that are sort of middle Tennessee. Most of them, there's a couple, maybe one in there, it's not. But anyway, so just so you have a reference, middle Tennessee, the average base rate that we charge to a home, a little under $4.50 a month. State average, a little under $4. You can see some of the more recent ones. Nashville's raised theirs up to $6. Goodlettsville's $6. Gallatin $5. That's kind of where people have been coming in here these days versus some of the programs that maybe implemented a decade or so ago that stayed where they are. But this just gives you a sense of what the typical home might see around Tennessee. So it's at $4, $5, $6. You got Chattanooga's a bit of an outlier, but that's typical homeowners. And again, so if you're 10 times that, you pay 10 times $5 or whatever it is. So you're paying $50 a month.
And I think one thing to point out here, as Dave said, a lot of these were implemented in the past 5 to 10 years, kind of in that time frame.
Yeah.
And a lot of these were set at that time. And so inflation obviously has gone up since then. So I think you're going to see the more recent ones are going to be higher. It's the ones that were done 5 and 10 years ago that set their rates then at what was an appropriate rate then, of course. And it might look low today versus what we might be looking at here in the next slide.
Yeah. So this is just gives you, these are draft kind of a rate model that we built, again, based on your properties and what you might generate with a base fee in those range. So got over there on the right, and it's included that table originally from the different levels of service, but over there on the right is, at least for our draft rate model that we've got for you, if you charge $3, $4, $5, $6, $7, those numbers there, what type of revenue would it generate based on the impervious area that you have in the community? So that just gives you a bit of a scale of what you might generate from a certain rates. And we benchmark those again against others to make sure we're kind of in range of what other folks are doing.
Capital improvement projects. I mean, early when municipalities launched this utility, there's big problems in Mount Juliet that need to be fixed.
Mhm.
$500,000. I mean, where do you start? I mean, it's pretty significant. I mean, we have some local
Yeah.
business owners here
Mhm.
tonight that have their business in Valley Center that flooded.
Yep.
To fix that problem is going to be millions of dollars.
Right. So see a couple different things. One, as I mentioned, some folks will just they won't improve any other aspect of their program right away. They'll just spend it all on capital. Some folks, if they've got a plan in place, they may bond a cluster of projects and use so you're accelerating that money, getting up front and spending it over time. So that's a lot of communities will go that route. They'll implement a utility, then they'll get a bond for a group of projects so they can tackle their sort of biggest issues and pay that back over time. That's one of the potential benefits of a utility is you have the dedicated revenue stream to pay for that bond versus if you're trying to do it in a capital or general fund program. It's a little harder to get good rates because you can't really say that money's dedicated to pay that back. So certainly folks that have bigger flooding problems, they'll either bond it or they maybe use the dedicated revenue to leverage other funds. We did work in Cleveland and they used it to leverage matching funds with the Army Corps to do some flood projects down there. So different ways people do to tackle bigger dollar projects.
So in this report, have we come up with estimates, some of the capital expense early on?
That's the ongoing work that Aaron's doing right now, is doing the modeling to see what the capacity of the system is and what those pipe improvements may be or channel improvements may be. So that's kind of an ongoing thing. That'll back up what the potential cost of your capital program may look like in the next 10 years.
Which is going to drive the fee, I would think.
It'll help set the fee, certainly. I mean, if that's really what your priority ends up being, then that's going to be a driver for what the fee would look like.
And I think what's important to note is a lot of cities will go through here and set based on the level of service that they expect. We actually made the choice to go ahead, me, my staff, we presented to the DOC as part of our agreement with CDM Smith to push forward. We wanted to go ahead and have that master plan. A lot of cities will not do that. They will go and they'll just say, we want a level of service B on operation maintenance and an A on capital improvements. They will go and they will set that, and then they will go and do the master plan after.
Yep.
And the master plan, it may or may not pay for that necessarily. I did not want to take that route. These are guesstimates based on other programs and basically where we're at today, which is around $700,000 expenditures. And so taking that for what it is, these are best guesstimates. That number can and will be massaged as we go through the process for the master plan itself. But a lot of cities don't have the master plan aspect of it.
That's exactly true. Most folks they'll set that first fee to kind of take care of their initial problems, and then they'll change it afterward to capture the capital needs. You're kind of a little bit a step ahead by doing the master planning at the same time. You'll know what your capital needs are as you're setting the rate, so you can make that decision about where you want to fund it with the capital in mind, versus where a lot of other cities, they don't know, so they're just sort of getting their program off the ground, and then they may look at it later.
Well, I'm glad we're doing it the right way.
Yeah,
Yes.
it absolutely is.
We're past time. You had a question. Anybody
Yeah.
else have any questions before we wrap it up?
Mine
Vice
should be
Mayor.
pretty brief. I want to, first of all, do we have a fee structure set up right now for new development and new commercial development to offset the costs? I mean, for instance, review and inspections, things of that nature. Do we have a fee structure set up for our stormwater that would go into that fund and offset the cost of the taxpayers? Number one question.
Yes. So we currently collect, I'm going to say around $300,000 to $400,000 is a pretty predictable number.
A year?
A year. This has
Okay.
been the past few years. It's been closer to that $400,000 number.
Okay. And I'm sorry.
It would be my recommendation that extra money that we set our fee based on what we're doing today, that additional money goes toward the capital plan.
Okay. The other question, for capital improvements, obviously, if we're having to do remediation for stormwater, then something happened in the initial planning that caused the problem. So are we going to do any planning with these people and do any additional stormwater planning so that we don't have those maintenance issues that will come up later on? Because I mean, I don't want, for instance, another Amazon to come in and then we go in and charge some small amount of money. And then 10, 15 years later on down the road, we're having to go in and do capital projects to take care of what we should have done initially. So is that going to be in the plan? And I mean, how's that going to be worked through?
Yeah, and I think where we're at today, I feel like we have a lot of good policies and design review and oversight of the installation today. I think where we're at, though, is we are dealing with development in the city of Mount Juliet prior to our current regulations and going back and having to fix that. So I think our financial risk is with the older developments.
For the capital improvements?
Yes, for the capital improvements.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
All right. Well, thank you for the presentation. Very insightful, and I know we got a lot of information to digest here as a board, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions going forward on this.
I just want to note, we have some other information that we're prepared to present tonight. I will send out the slideshow to all the commission members, and we can, I guess, Sheila, we can probably work on getting that posted on our website for more information, and we can go back, maybe have some further discussions on that later.
Quickly, I'm
Yes.
going to have something back to the board so we can review and.
Dave, what was our timeline for the master plan from that perspective?
The master plan to be completed sometime this summer. So that's a little, that's staggered behind this. And so that'll help, certainly, but we've got, the model is done for the most part. We've been sort of augmenting the missing data right now. So, yeah, so
Renders of all the modeling at the end of this here.
yeah, so we're moving along pretty well on the modeling.
Yeah, so that's the FEMA, that's the current FEMA map for all the red lines. Look at it, Dave. That's the model as it exists right now. Looks like that. Well, if y'all ever want to have some sort of side meeting or invite me back to talk, I'd be happy to talk at length about the modeling and what ramifications it's going to have on the capital plan.
But we can definitely start getting some estimates together on potential project size. We're not going to have, planning level idea on what these projects are, because we're, just not there yet with the model, but that's really going to be done this summer. We'll get to that point, but in terms of the utility rate structure, that sort of thing, we have enough now to forecast what a fee might be, what the revenue would be, and then make as you mentioned, the capital program is going to be bigger than what you can fund today. So it's really going to be about setting where are we going to start on the capital stuff, and that'll really inform sort of the long-term vision of what it may look like.
Well, thank you again for the presentation. And Andy, of course, thank you for organizing all this as well.
Yep.
So,
and I'll pass around a proposal of a first project and what that might cost.
all right. And with that, hearing no objections, we will adjourn this workshop. We will reconvene at 6:15 for our public hearing on the items on second reading tonight. And then for our regular meeting, we'll start at 6:30. Thank you, everyone.